Hi everyone, thanks for coming back for part 2. I just want to clarify that I'm not trying to say that it's going to be 10 years from now that Jesus comes back. What I'm trying to say is that I wouldn't be surprised if when Jesus comes back that time would go forward to the years 2027 AD and 2028 AD. I just believe the numbers 27 and 28 are synonymous with 2017 and 2018 in the scriptures is what I'm seeing. But the pattern also seems to be that the rapture is talked about in verse 17 or 27 as well as culminating in verse 18 or 28. That's actually the pattern that I'm seeing. And so in verse 18 is where it says, "As I live, saith the King, whose name is the Lord of hosts, surely as Tabor is among the mountains, and as Carmel by the sea, so shall he come." And it's talking about the Pharaoh, king of Egypt. But of course, Jesus comes at the same time. And this is basically what it's talking about. It's talking about the day of the Lord. And so the other thing that I wanted to point out is the pattern with the numbers 17 and 18 and how this all has to do with DNA, which is why I was looking at the references of the river Euphrates, because this is one of the 4 rivers that the river in the Garden of Eden branched off into. And the reason I think this is important is because this is one of the rivers that's talked about in the book of Revelation, and I just wanted to explain how I believe this all has to do with DNA. But it's interesting that you have from Revelation 9 through 11, it's talking about the Antichrist or Abaddon or Apollyon coming out of the pit. And it's interesting, this comes up in verse 11, which I've mentioned before, of how I believe the number 11 has to do with DNA, usually in the scriptures. And you can also even see it in the words that God uses, such as the word Apollyon. You can see the 2 L's over there. And some time ago, I had looked at the word Abaddon in the Hebrew just to see if it looked like that. And even the Strong's number, you can see it's 623. So even the Strong's number reflects that this has to do with DNA. And so I looked at it in the Hebrew. Okay, that would actually be this one over here, G3, which is the Greek version of Abaddon. And what I noticed is that the Strong's number for the Hebrew is H11. So again, you have a reference to the number 11 with the word Abaddon or Apollyon. And so I believe this all has to do with DNA, and this is connected with the number 6, just as Apollyon was connected with the number 6. And of course, 6 is the number of man, and the number of the Antichrist is 666. And so if we go back to Apollyon, we'll see that it was Strong's number 623. Okay, and then after that, starting from verse 12, it says, "One woe is past, and behold, there come 2 woes more hereafter. And the 6th angel sounded, and I heard a voice from the 4 horns of the golden altar, which is before God, saying to the 6th angel, which had the trumpet, loose the 4 angels which are bound in the great river Euphrates." And it's interesting, this comes up in verse 14, which I've talked about. I believe verse 14 usually represents the 144,000. And I believe this is also referring to DNA. Whenever you have the number 4, I believe it's talking about or alluding to the 4 nitrogenous bases. But as I've mentioned before, I believe this also has a physical application as well. And there was a video by Leland Jones where he drew a connection between this and Jeremiah 51. Okay, and this is where it says, "And it shall be, when thou hast made an end of reading this book, that thou shalt bind a stone to it and cast it into the midst of the Euphrates." And if you look at the entire chapter of Jeremiah 51, you also see this pattern that I was talking about with the numbers 17 and 18, but it's tricky how this one works because you have the 1 in Jeremiah 51, and so when you go to verse 7, it makes the number 17, and so here it's talking about mystery Babylon. It says, Babylon hath been a golden cup in the Lord's hand, that made all the earth drunken. The nations have drunken of her wine, therefore the nations are mad. Babylon is suddenly fallen and destroyed. Howl for her, take balm for her pain, if so be she may be healed. And it's in Revelation 18 where it says Babylon is fallen. Okay, so I'll just show you that. It's in Revelation 18, and you see that Jeremiah 51 makes the number 18. It's also in verse 8 in Revelation 14, which 14 is 7 plus 7, and it's the Hebrew year 77. So there definitely seems to be a pattern with the numbers 17 and 18, but it's all the way down in verse, I believe it was 63, where it talks about the stone being bound to the word of God, and then it was cast into the Euphrates. And then if you go to Revelation 18, you see that you have a great millstone, and this is coming up in verse 21 and 22. So you see the millstone mentioned again in 22. And again, I believe when God uses words like this, it's alluding to DNA. Okay, so I looked at the meaning of the word millstone, and it says it's a large mill that consisted of 2 stones, an upper and an under one. The nether stone was stationary, but the upper one was turned by an ass, a mill, the noise made by a mill. Okay, so I looked at some images of a millstone, so you can see what that looks like. So it's made out of the 2 stones. And so you have the stationary one, which I believe would represent the leading strand, and then you have the one that moves, that's pulled by the donkey, and that crushes the wheat. And if you put in millstone in Revelation 18, you can see what that looks like, and you can see that it comes up in verses 21 through 24, and I had done a video about a table that I did on Nibiru, and I called it Nibiru, the party's over. I used this image in the thumbnail. But if you put in the word Nibiru, you see that comes up with 2 matches, and the first match is coming up in Joshua, which is the name Jesus in the Old Testament in the Hebrew, 27, which looks like 2017, and 28, which looks like 2018, are the 2 scriptures that are coming up. And then the next match comes up in the book of Peter, which Peter means rock. Okay, and I just added the word ear so you can see a little bit of the matrix, but I've talked about how at the top it has the words the Avenger of Blood, and then right under that you have the Avenger of Blood once again. So I believe this is representing Jesus. Over here it says for judgment. And then you also have the word heaven, which is formed by pushing the letters together. And so I believe this is a parallel to Revelation 18 and the millstone, and I believe it also has to do with DNA. And incidentally, there's 11 scriptures that come up in the Bible that have to do with a millstone. You can see 11 Bible verses about millstones, and the very first one has number 46 in it, and then this goes through all 11 verses. And so I believe that's another indication that the millstone represents DNA. And so this would also be a parallel to Revelation 9:14, where it says to loose the 4 angels which are bound in the great river Euphrates. And the 4 angels were loosed, which were prepared for an hour and a day and a month and a year to slay a third part of men. And the number of the army of the horsemen were 200,000, and I heard the number of them. And if you look at the word 1,000, you see that it actually says 2 myriads of myriads. So it doesn't give an exact number. I believe this is referring to the great multitude and to the 2 witnesses. And it's interesting, again, you have the number 46 in the midst of the word myriads. And then the word 2 has the numbers 14 and 17. So I believe the 2 witnesses are connected to those numbers because it's in Revelation 14 that you have the 144,000. And it's in Revelation 11:7, which makes number 17, when the 2 witnesses finish their testimony. And I've talked about how I believe that this all goes full circle after the 3.5 years, that it goes back to 2017, that everything seems to be hinged around the number 17. I've also talked about how I believe the horseman represents the 4 nitrogenous bases, and you can see the number 46, which has to do with DNA right in the middle of the word horseman. And if you look at the word horse, again, you have the number 46 right in the middle, and that's in between the 2 2's, which itself represents a DNA strand. And so I had made a video about that some time ago, but if you go on to verse 17, which again, this is an important verse over here, it says, "And thus I saw the horses in the vision, and them that sat on them, having breastplates of fire and of jacinth and brimstone, and the heads and the horses were as the heads of lions, and out of their mouths issued fire, smoke, and brimstone." And this is one of the verses that I've been wanting to talk about for a really long time, because this word jacinth is the word hyacinth in the Greek, and this is basically one of the stones that Satan was missing, or Lucifer was missing, on his ephod. And I talked about this article in the video that I did about colors, dyes, and microscopic things, and why God's favorite color is royal blue. And I talked about this article over here about how the woman riding the beast had no color blue in Revelation 17 and 18. And then there was the 3rd row that was missing off of Lucifer's ephod. Okay, and this was in Exodus 28, where the instructions were given for the ephod and the priestly garments. But if you go to Ezekiel 28, this is where you see that Lucifer was missing some of the precious stones, and he was actually missing the 3rd row, as it says over here. So he was missing these colors, and one of the colors is ligure, which is another word for jacinth. And you can see that when you look at the word ligure, you see that it's another word for jacinth. Okay, if you go to the next chapter in Ezekiel, chapter 29, this is where Satan says, "My river is mine own, and I have made it for myself." And it was actually this verse right here that made me realize that the river in the Garden of Eden actually represents DNA and the tree of life. And that was when I had done my table on tree of life and river of life and DNA strand, and they all came up in Genesis 2:14 through 2:24, and the word strand was coming up where it said, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and shall cleave unto his wife." So this was coming up exactly where it was talking about God taking the rib from Adam and making the woman, and how the two will cleave and become one flesh. So I believe this is definitely talking about DNA. And so I believe the color blue here, the color jacinth, represents the restoration of the DNA, and that this is definitely referring to God's army and the 2 witnesses. And then in verse 18 it talks about how fire and smoke and brimstone is issued out of their mouths, which would correspond with the 2 witnesses. But I'm about out of time, so I'll have to continue in the next video. Thanks for watching, and God bless you.